Okay, we are going to get started in just a minute. So if everyone can take your seats. And we'll go ahead and invite our panelists up to the stage. Thank you. So it is my pleasure to welcome Kanwaljit Singh and Yi Zhang from Critical Path Institute to open our session of Advancing Tangible Real-World Evidence Case Studies.
Good morning. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. As an introduction, I'm Kanwaljit Singh, Executive Director of International Neonatal Consortium at Critical Path Institute. As the name suggests, my program is basically focused on drug development in neonates for neonates. And, we work with academic researchers, industry researchers, parents, nursing groups, and regulatory agencies, EMA, FDA, PMDA, and all the rest, with the ultimate mission of advancing drug development in multiple conditions of prematurity. Our portfolio has been developing and moderating a little bit of late, but ultimately our mission basically remains the same. To the people who are in the panel here, and also to some of the people who might be familiar with neonatal drug development, they would not be surprised to know that if it is not the most, one of the most complicated issues and challenging conditions in the neonatal intensive care unit is bronchopulmonary dysplasia, or BPD. It's a chronic lung disease of prematurity, multifactorial causes, but the way it is most challenging is for the past 30 years, people have been trying over and over again to find new treatments, but nothing has worked. There has not been a single treatment for BPD. It's a condition that has been increasing in prevalence, one of the only conditions of prematurity that has been increasing in prevalence, but no treatments at all. So it's a big concern, big challenge. And as a result, it's one of the major focus areas for us at International Neonatal Consortium. I think the cost to the society for BPD is something like $1 million per patient per year. Probably like hundreds of billions of dollars overall to the US society as a whole. So that's how serious this issue is. And it's a lifelong condition, no treatment, no cure, nothing whatsoever. Let me see. Okay. As I said, there are few treatments available, and nothing has worked thus far. It's a complex disease mechanism, difficult to treat. There are relatively small patient populations simply because premature infants are kind of a small population. There are multiple unmet needs, anyways. So basically, the idea is that INC has been very interested in finding and working collaboratively to create those tools and solutions that help advance the drug development in bronchopulmonary dysplasia. It is my personal belief, and it is not without without reason, that in neonatology, specifically for bronchopulmonary dysplasia, as you know, that one of the Critical Path Institute's big core competencies is working with data to create those quantitative drug development solutions that help optimize the conduct of clinical trials in BPD, right? It is my personal belief, and there's definitely a lot of truth to that for neonatology, specifically for bronchopulmonary dysplasia, real-world data types, specifically electronic health record data types, are going to be particularly usable, particularly suitable to create those tools and solutions. The reason being simply that every single premature infant that is born in the US, outside of the US, is always going to be admitted in a neonatal intensive care unit from the moment they're born and to the moment they're actually discharged and they're well enough to actually go home. So the entirety of their clinical care information, their medications, their progress, their clinical course during the stay is always going to be available for us to actually take advantage of and create those tools and solutions like no other data type can do that. You can use the electronic health record data and patient registries to develop models, solutions that simulate clinical clinical scenarios. You can actually use it to create clinical trial endpoints. You can combine real-world data types with other data types from clinical trials and come up with a lot of early identifying models, predictive models, and the type of things that you can potentially do with EHR data and real-world data for BPD and in general for neonatal drug development is basically endless. The topic of the discussion today is basically going to be, to our panelists who are gathered here, understanding from their perspective. We have people from industry, we have people from academia, we have regulators from EMA and FDA, and we have a parent of a preemie, who has had a significant amount of experience dealing with her own child who had bronchopulmonary dysplasia, and understanding everybody's perspective about what is wrong with BPD, why there has not been any drug development in BPD, how we can create those tools and solutions to solve the problems with BPD, and how we can particularly leverage real-world data to create those tools and solutions, and how we can potentially all work collaboratively to solve this problem, which has been kind of an intractable problem over the past 30 years. Fortunately, over the past 4 years, CPATH and International Neonatal Consortium has been working on a real-world data analytics platform where, exact thing that I told you, we have been collecting and integrating data from electronic health record data and other data types from patients in the neonatal intensive care unit, and basically creating a large database that we are calling as real-world data analytics platform, and using it to create actionable neonatal drug development solutions. Over the past 4 years, we have accumulated almost 380,000 patients, very granular data, detailed longitudinal data containing a lot of information on their clinical care, medications, outcomes, and so on and so forth, demographic variables, and patient level information. And we're basically going to be over the next several years working with that data to create those tools and solutions. And that being said, this is basically the panel that we have gathered here. We have a distinguished panel from Dr. Ralph Bax, who is from European Medicines Agency, Jonathan Davis from Tufts Medical Center, Deb Dicenza, who is one of our parent advocates from Preemie Bird Foundation, Anne Massaro from FDA, and Victoria Nicholas from Oak Hill Bio. And my co-moderator for the session is Yi Zhang, who is from Quantitative Medicine Division at Critical Path Institute. So with that, I'm going to open the panel discussion. Given that we have a lot of people here on the panel, what I really wanted to was start with one of our parent members, Deb Dicenza, because she has had a lot of lived experience living with a patient, her child, who was a preemie, and understanding from her perspective, what does she think is wrong in drug development in neonatology and bronchopulmonary dysplasia specifically? And then from there on, we're going to continue the discussion. So Deb, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Deb Dicenza. I run the Preemie World Foundation. I also am a co-founder of the Alliance for Black NICU Families. No, I'm not Black. I'm an ally forever. And I also run another nonprofit called the Books for Healing Partnership. I have found that patient education is a really key component to building trust. My daughter, who turned 21 last Saturday, has had a real journey. She was a 30-weeker. She stayed in for 38 days. She came home on oxygen and a monitor, and they were saying she's doing great. Well, let me tell you what great looks like. Great looks like an infant on oxygen and a monitor, medications, a whole team of specialists that first year. And I'm asking about her development the whole time through. She did not qualify for early intervention. We had a hospital readmit within 5 days after we got home because she was having trouble breathing, a lot of alarms on the monitor, and she stopped eating. And we were trying to figure out how to be parents throughout this whole journey. I had trusted the NICU so intently that I wanted to bring her back there, not to the pediatric unit. But she came home a couple days later. They had changed the regimen. I felt more like a nurse than I did a parent. And that continues. I will run through this very quickly, but Becky went into early intervention about 18 months of age, calendar age. And she required all sorts of therapies, got kicked out after 7 months, went to Child Find Preschool after that because the preschool teacher who I'd asked to please be proactive, not reactive, to actually go in and get some help for her. That translated to kindergarten. In kindergarten, I kept saying there's something not right. By the end of the year, she was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. My heart was crushed. I felt like there was always another shoe dropping, always. And it never, ever went away. ADHD followed in second grade because I told the pediatrician at the well check that we were talking about it. I had to be extremely vocal like I had been with all these other people. We went through third grade and I'm like, something's still not right. What's with her walking gait? Took her to a developmental pediatrician. Oh, she's doing fine. Just get her some occupational therapy. She has a motor coordination disorder. Okay. If you look up that disorder, what does it look like? By 11 years old, Becky was in with a personal trainer because we had to keep her moving. She wasn't moving. I kept saying something's not right. I'm watching her ankles on an elliptical. I'm right behind her. I see her ankles squishing and rolling. I'm like, what is that? Ultimately, we went to an orthopedic surgeon who I asked very quietly under my breath, is it possible this is cerebral palsy? No, if it is, it's really, really, really mild. No diagnosis. 13 and a half years old, Becky had just had her bat mitzvah 6 months before. We're back in the orthopedic surgeon's office. Becky, run up and down the hallway and then walk. You could see the difference. Things had gotten worse. And next to me, the doctor's head's next to mine as we're looking out the door. And she says, how early was she? And I felt that cold dread down my spine. We went back in and she showed me Becky's ankle. She said, this is spasticity. How did I know? I didn't know. I just knew something wasn't right. Becky's a very smart young lady who started taking college classes at 14. So we had to juggle what I felt like were triplets, the gifted side, special needs side, and the somewhat normal side. I have to tell you that I thought, well, okay, she's got scoliosis too. Okay, I think we're okay. She's doing okay. Things are mild. We're good. Becky has had more times in the doctor's office in urgent care where we were struggling with her cough that wouldn't go away. She got diagnosed with asthma at 2 years of age. That has not stopped, even though she'd like to not use the inhaler. We've had COVID a couple of times, and this last round, we had a urgent care doctor say, if the prednisone doesn't work, we're going to start talking pneumonia. I've heard pneumonia several times throughout Becky's childhood. She's a child. I look at this. We are now at the 21-year mark, and that was exciting. But as we took her through Europe, we've had to start using wheelchairs. These are the things that come out of a stay in the NICU. It doesn't stop. It keeps going. And as these babies get older and older, more stuff pops up. Trust me, I talk to the premature adults. They say this stuff sticks with you for life. And there's a lot more coming. So I want you all to remember this, that there are many things parents are juggling, and that having a really smart kid does not make up for all the troubles that are coming with it. It's really hard to juggle. Becky's very lucky. She has two very involved parents. But when I hear the thing about prednisone and I hear about pneumonia and x-rays, that's terrifying. I go back to that moment when she was born. Is she going to breathe? Is she going to cry? Terrifying. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb. So I think I'm gonna transition to our regulatory colleagues and basically pose the question, what exactly from FDA's perspective are the most critical gaps? What is wrong with BPD drug development? What are the most critical gaps that hinder drug development in BPD and that need to be solved so that this field can actually move ahead from the gap of 30 years since nothing has been done thus far?
I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Ann Mazzaro. I'm a supervisory physician in the Office of Pediatric Therapeutics. And I'll just say that this meeting has been wonderful because it kind of validated what we did in our office with our reorganization a few years ago to put our rare pediatric disease program and neonatology program together. And those are the two teams that I oversee. So when we did that, it was with the thinking that a lot of these lessons learned, challenges, and to Klaus's point, opportunities really do overlap between the neonatal space and the rare disease space, because most of our diseases in neonatology and prematurity are really rare diseases, and a lot of the challenges we have with trials and getting drugs through the registration and approval process really are similar. So there was a lot of overlap in the discussions over the last few days that I've been hearing that has really resonated with both sides, both hats that I wear. With regards to the question, I think the three top challenges. Number one is endpoints. We really have been having this discussion, and we've talked in our INC meetings that we've and I joined kind of into the process of the INC, but I know that a lot of these discussions started many years ago, and a lot of the discussions are still continuing as far as what is that clinically relevant endpoint. What is the disease definition of BPD? Does that count as a clinically relevant endpoint? Does it map to, what we are looking for as far as clinical outcome that matters to patients? And we've done some work in the last few years in kind of continuing that discussion and had a patient listening session. You've heard about that over the last few days, of that opportunity to bring patients in, parents and caregivers of, and a patient with BPD, an adult survivor with BPD, to kind of tell us, because we've had a lot of discussions with the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care in trying to define, what that outcome of relevance is. And I say it's still, that patient listening session was really helpful. As neonatologists, we are saying the thing that we know is, if a baby goes home with a tracheostomy or on a ventilator, those are severe outcomes. And we know that that is important, and we know that's an important outcome that we want to avoid. But to hear the patients tell us, going home on oxygen and a monitor, even if that means a year from now they're going to look like their peers, that's still a really important outcome to families. So those kinds of interactions, I think, really help us and help inform as we're developing these programs to evaluate potential drugs and therapeutics is really critical to how we think about endpoint selection for our trials. The other common theme that we often get with programs coming in is this concept of harmonization of care. So we've gotten a lot of analogies about the NICU being the Wild West, and John and Victoria, other neonatologists on the panel, can speak to this. There's a lot of variability in care, which makes it really difficult in the context of a clinical trial to have interpretable endpoints, especially endpoints that depend on things like how long a baby is on respiratory support or on oxygen, because some of those things can be provider center dependent. So having some way, and we struggle with that concept of pragmatic trials, real world, that reflect real world practice, and that variability, and that ability to really have interpretable data at the end of the day. So I'd say that's another challenge that we frequently are discussing in a lot of the programs that come through. And then the third, challenge, I think, is just we're in uncharted territory. As you mentioned, we have no approved products. There's no regulatory path, no selected endpoints. So it really is, a lot of discussions, and I think you've heard common theme again across all of the regulators who've been on panels, is to come in early and have those discussions with the division so that we can get agreement on what these trials, when we get to that point and having pivotal trials, looks like, so that, that there's that partnership and collaboration along the way.
Great, thank you, Anne. What's interesting and I would say sad is that I think like 7 or 10 years ago, INC had conducted a similar type of a meeting of stakeholders before. And the questions that you are saying now are the unmet needs and challenges were exactly the same. And between that period, there has been absolutely no progress thus far. So that's basically how challenging this is. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, okay, well, yeah, there's no progress, but now we have more data, right? Much more data. And this is a question to Ralph. And I understand we're probably facing the same problem in European colleagues, but we saw the platform showcased yesterday, like a Darwin system, like other collection of the data. How would those data be utilized for neonatal drug development?
Okay, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for letting me be here and participate in this meeting, which is really also from EMA perspective, a very important one. And then secondly, okay, perhaps I'm an optimist. I don't want to be too pessimistic. I actually want to say, and I'm saying that Inc. is not just jumping into some new data collection activity, but because of all this work, EMA is actually referring to, if we think about definitions and so on, because all this work did show the complexity, and I think it wasn't completely lost time. So we are just actually revising our neonatal guideline, which is has been going on for too long, where we are actually will be referring to outcomes from these discussions, and there will be a public consultation, and US experts can contribute to it. If we now secondly, I wanted to mention also pathways. I mean, we're not living for pathways. My background is also pediatrician neonatologist, and I just happened accidentally to become a regulator. So you know, it's like when I was at hospital, I sort of distanced myself from this hospital, and sometimes I do some similar things nowadays. But indeed, we are really, there has been a little bit of a paradigm shift when also in Europe we finally had the pediatric legislation, finally had the opportunity to sit down together with medicine developers to discuss and also take a little bit responsibility for a development plan, which hadn't been ever the case before. Before it was just, you know, show us your data and then we will decide. Now it's a little bit different, and we have to also take responsibility potentially and for sure if things are not working out so well. So we are also as regulators pushed to work on this. And I just wanted to mention all these activities don't make so much sense if then developers don't come early to us, but confront us as not so long time ago with a finalized program, in this condition, and this is really then we do think, okay, we have to improve our communication even more. So with respect to using new technologies, of course, there's a lot of hope in it, but also some skepticism. And as Cecile just mentioned, with our extrapolation experience, which unfortunately is not so much usable in the youngest population, but it really is a showcase, as Cecile just has explained very well, of the stepwise approach and getting to specifically look at uncertainties, which will also be the case even if we have these real world data. What are we going to do with all these data? How are we going to handle them? So even if the extrapolation concept now has reached, congratulations, this step, it's still, to be realistic, it's still a point being discussed nearly on a daily basis. So because still people say, yes, we just extrapolate. So we need to avoid also in the topic of real world evidence such an approach to be critical and to develop something which is meaningful right from the outset. And here I have big hopes. And And as a regulator, we need to be agile. So anything which comes along and where we are trying to also focus on discussions in this space, in the framework of consortia, and also to learn, this will be supported. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm glad both you and I mentioned there is a unclear path in terms of regulatory pathway for drug makers. So next question is for Victoria, and obviously you see some opportunities. So how would you like to navigate that pathway in
Yes.
drug making?
Thank you. So I'm Victoria Nicholas. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Oak Hill Bio. I've also got 30 years as a clinical neonatologist and translational scientist. So I've been at the bedside and at every stage of moving forward and bringing new therapies to newborns in general and extremely premature newborns very specifically. So we're navigating, clearly everybody has highlighted the central issue, which is the absence of a well-worn path. And so we utilize as best we can the science that exists and the understanding of our particular drug, and really leveraging that understanding to develop a clinical study, which is currently ongoing, to demonstrate a difference in terms of the reduction of bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which, as we've heard, is the most common complication of prematurity and the greatest long-term predictor of chronic lung disease. And Deb's, really searing comments highlight the importance of what we do. Now, what are the challenges when there isn't a well-worn path? Well, the challenges start with even access to funding, because it's very difficult to sit in front of a venture capital firm to say, we believe in this drug, we believe in our development path. And they say, well, what are your endpoints? Are they proven? Is this accelerated? And if you can't answer those questions, you're passed over. And that's also in the context of extremely premature newborns are almost invisible at some level to the world. And, those of us that have been struggling at the bedside, the parents among us, and I know the regulatory agencies, they're very, very visible. So looking at these patients as rare has made a huge difference. And Deb and Susan McCune and I actually led a panel at one of the rare disease organizations. And I think that's going to get the visibility that we need to drive the path to progress. Now, in terms of a clinical study, well, bronchopulmonary dysplasia is a disease. It is a disease that we're understanding far better now than we did when I started my career in neonatology some 30 years ago. And so we know it's a disease. So let's focus on the fact that this is a disease the way lung cancer is a disease. But if you start to look at all comers, that's when the world gets murky. So focusing on those infants with the highest severity of disease, which with the highest likelihood of long-term respiratory complications, neurodevelopmental disability, as well as even death. So really, we've worked on focusing our clinical study to look at reduction in severe bronchopulmonary dysplasia and bring to the mix the best indicators that we have of improvement or lack of improvement. So what are those indicators of severity? Well, the NICHD respiratory severity score, the Jensen scoring, and putting those head to head. And when you actually look at it, the major difference between the NICHD criteria and the Jensen criteria is how oxygen factors into that mix. But they all really look at respiratory technology support, which is the driver in the indicator. It's not just oxygen, it's respiratory technology support. And that's captured in both severe categories. So leveraging what we understand in the world as a clinical syndrome, leveraging the input from our families and our advocacy organizations and bringing that to the agency in an open dialogue, but falling within the guidelines as well. I just want to mention one other thing. One of the other challenges outside of the well-worn path is looking for consistency between the agencies. What are the European authorities supporting? what is the FDA supporting? And when there's an imbalance in enthusiasm for what that path looks like, it makes it considerably more difficult from the perspective of the developer, as well as, you know, what the long-term path looks like.
Great, thank you. And now I just wanted to pose a similar type of question to John with your clinician and academic researcher hat on. You see these patients on a day-to-day basis. You've been trying to conduct clinical trials in PPD for, I guess, more time than I've been born. What do you think are, in your perspective, the most important challenge, so to speak, in PPD drug development? Why there has not been any drug? Then I'm gonna move on to some of the potential solutions that we can actually develop.
Thanks. Yes, I look pretty good for 90, don't I? So, putting it in perspective, I'm the chief of neonatology at Tufts and an attending physician at Boston Children's Hospital. And in my career, I've probably supervised the care of somewhere around 300,000 or 400,000 neonates. And when you look at the United States, we have the highest rates of prematurity of any affluent country in the world. It's about 11%. It hasn't really changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And despite the March of Dimes estimating that we pay over $28 billion a year on prematurity, the last drug that made a significant impact on survival and outcome, and it was a drug that I helped develop, that was approved by the FDA, was in 1991. That was the last drug that we have. 90% of the drugs we use in the NICU are used off-label. It just isn't acceptable. We have the highest rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality, again, of any affluent country in the world. We need to do something different. And I write a number of the textbooks in neonatology on BPD, and wrote the first one in 1994. I just updated my chapter for the 5th time and didn't really change the treatment section. So in 30 years, we haven't really made any progress whatsoever. So how do we change that paradigm? Well, one of them is this group. Even sitting on the panel, we're really well represented with the opportunity to have industry regulators and academic physicians, parents, nurses, and others come together and work collaboratively. We are on the same team. Ultimately, we want to improve the care for our babies, and what we have now is not working. It's just not acceptable. And I think the things that Deb really poignantly presents is we're so unique in neonatology, we call these babies therapeutic orphans because we just fly by the seat of our pants, literally, in the way we treat them. There's tremendous variability, nothing standardized. And so how do we change that paradigm? Well, part of it is these kinds of collaborations where we're now in multiple, 25 or 30 countries throughout the world, working with a variety of regulatory agencies, and really trying to push the drug development paradigm to make a tremendous impact. How do we do that? Well, a lot of it is based on data. And it's something that Critical Path has really organized as the quarterback of this team and getting us all together with a single purpose to move this field forward. And we were delighted to get a grant from the FDA to obtain a very unique data set. It doesn't exist worldwide of, you've heard between 300 and 400,000 babies from Japan, from Europe, from Canada, from the United States, because data are power. I think Critical Path's shown us that. And we can really make much more informed decisions about things like outcome measures. So we've put this data set together. Dr. Romero and I were the co-PIs for this trial. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done in 40 years in neonatology, trying to get records from people who didn't want to share records, to try to get it into a database where we had different units, values for laboratory studies in Japan and the US, et cetera. people wanted to get paid because it was a lot of effort to get their IT departments that are already well overburdened to give us the data that we need. And we ultimately got data from registries, from clinical trials. One of the first times that industry has given up their data, de-identified data to us to use. That was really critical, and the electronic health records. And that's very important too, and yet we have to be cautious with all these different data sources, as a paper just came out this week in JAMA Network Open saying that electronic health records, ethnicity and race are often wrong, the way they're documented in the EHR. So we're hopeful that many of the things that we've talked about so far are going to be available to us as we mine these data sets. But it's very labor intensive to try to get these records in shape for us to be able to look at. It's very intensive and difficult to decide who we're going to look at. But we're hopeful if we can identify the major risk factors for BPD, instead of having a clinical trial where you just enroll 300 or 400 babies who are less than 28 weeks gestation, that we can actually find the kids who are at highest risk and get them into the clinical trials. How long do we track these kids and follow them up for? We've had studies where it wasn't until the children turned 15 or 16 that you could find a noticeable difference between the treatment, and yet none of those studies are powered for those kinds of long-term outcomes. So that's a challenge for us. Can we change the way clinical trials are done by substituting some of our controls in our data set for actually control patients in clinical trials? And that's something that FDA has issued guidance on. And I promise Lin Yao all the time, we're doing that really carefully because we recognize the challenges of doing that for clinical trials, but yet the regulators are working with us to develop these types of techniques to move the field forward. And that would change not only neonatal research, but as Klaus said, the way clinical trials are conducted for all rare patient populations. So we're very excited about this opportunity to use our real-world database to generate real-world evidence, because we think it can have a tremendous impact.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm going to go back to Victoria because I wanted to ask her a very, very specific question. We've all discussed all those challenges with BPD drug development over the past 30 years. Knowing what we know are the issues, what sort of solutions from drug developer perspective would you like to be developed so that that actually helps you and other people who are also in BPD drug development, that makes it easier for you guys to conduct your clinical trials?
Well, I think John actually mentioned it in his comments, but it's a cultivated data set that you can use to mimic or even be a synthetic arm for a clinical study, which is clearly going to shorten a path to an approval. The second would be, can you use that data set to model disease? So can you identify infants with the most severe form of disease and then follow them over their life course and then use that as evidence to support a path to development? I think the Danish healthcare data records were highlighted earlier in the session this morning. And we actually modeled using that, and this was probably about 5 years ago. And the downside of those data were it didn't translate into the NICU. So infants, fantastic, but the NICU linking hadn't been done yet. So that wasn't available, even though there's an existing very robust data set that would surround it. So I think in terms of acceleration, that would be certainly using real-world evidence to support disease progression, to support endpoints, and to support trial design and acceleration would be an area, and certainly an area that we're actively engaged with INC on.
And I'm glad you mentioned the quality of the data, both of you, Victoria and John. But I think the data comes from patients. So the next question is to Deb. What kind of obstacles you have run into when you sign the consent form, you try to enroll, and try to get retained during the contribution of the data.
Can you repeat that, please? Sorry.
So have you run into any issues when as a parent of a patient, when you want to contribute to clinical studies, when you contribute to observational studies?
Okay, so I've never, full disclosure, we never had to put Becky into a clinical trial. But if I did, the biggest question I would have is how are you going to treat her and how are you going to keep her safe? And and as we've all discussed on the leadership team for Inc., the patient families always want to be picked for the drug being tested. That's just reality. Parents, I mean, ultimately, this is a creation of trust between the provider and the parent. And when you start adding in another layer to that for clinical trials, then you wonder as a parent, wait, I thought we were working together. Who's this? You got to build that whole new relationship again. And honestly, a lot of advocacy groups across the globe are usually reached out to by companies, by researchers to ask for help when it comes to recruiting for clinical trials. I've never been asked. I'd be happy to be asked because I believe that I can sit in a room with that parent and build that trust faster than anybody else because I've sat at that bedside. I've sat there and wondered, what does the future look like? And I also think that with the trust, the clinicians need to work really hard on telling the parents from the get-go, what does that outcome look like? And if you don't know, say you don't know. You need to be honest. And it's not the failure of medicine, it's just that neonatology hasn't been around for very long. And you talk about sizing down adult drugs, parents don't know that. I walked into the NICU and thought, wow, what an amazing place. These people really know what they're doing. And that, it's just incredible. I trusted these people immediately. On the other side of it, I've learned about how many things are done by the seat of your pants. And I think that's to me it's shocking, but I'm also a person who wants to put energy toward it and help grow this. And that's the beauty of what Inc. has created and provided. It's given me and other parents and advocates the opportunity to speak up, to talk about endpoints, to talk about drug development, talk to venture capitalists about the proposition. We have a unique opportunity to do that. And I'm grateful for Inc. because it's given me that voice, that ability to say, why and what's so important. And this data means everything to me. It gives me hope. It gives me hope in a time that I was wondering, are we ever going to get there with this drug development? Thank you.
I think I'm going to pose a question to both Anne and to Ralph, because I wanted to understand both FDA and EMA perspectives about, the specific use cases and utility and advantages of using EHR and real world data to create those tools and solutions that both Victoria and John has been talking about from basically, FDA and EMA perspective. And do you want to go first?
Sure. And I'll say I'm probably going to have a similar tone to Ralph's cautious optimism around this. Of course, I think we've been involved as a partner through this project and see the big potential. I think when we talk about jumping to those steps of disease progression models or I think you called it synthetic arms or external controls, those kinds of concepts, I think we have to be a little bit careful because we need to kind of walk before we run. I think, when we talk about external controls, we have other issues when we're looking at, what will come in the package at the end of the day. Will that be an open label trial? Like there's a lot of other issues that go into, when we look at the data that comes in. So I think when we are, the wealth, and I see the richness and the possibilities with these data, I think some of the areas that maybe are good to start with are using that data for understanding more about the natural history of the disease, maybe informing priors. We talked a lot about, innovative trial designs like that. Those are spaces where I think are really ripe for the use and leveraging of real world data to help inform our trials and help maybe reduce the numbers that we need in the trials. I don't know if it will be able to get rid of the need for a control arm, but I think some of those thoughts and ways to leverage this data, but within a framework that still leads to a package that supports the safety and effectiveness for us to review at the end of the day.
Great.
So I'll stop
Thank you.
there and that.
Yeah, Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting when I joined today and then to hear this good example of Denmark, which you have extended, but also shown its limitations potentially. Because in Europe, we always look to the US and say, look how they are managing. And, and we will, with our European complexity, with our different healthcare systems, where we hear even from hospitals, where even, hospitals are such administrators. I've spoken to a PDCO delegate who is leading a hospital in Poland, and there are so many also pseudo hurdles which might then be used not to share. So I believe we need to provide this example and use this experience that indeed we have listed all these challenges: data quality, variability, privacy, GDPR, but there are also solutions to it. So we don't just get stuck at the challenge level. So there we would also support. Yes, we have been now looking much more proactively at real world data and evidence, as you know, and just even outside of neonatology, looking into databases available, there are really hardly any pediatric data available. So I'm not even speaking about neonates. So I do believe that we need to work on these data that Europe might need, needs to contribute more, and potentially we can discuss also tomorrow how to extend this initiative a little bit to Europe more in order to extend these data sets. But as John has mentioned, it's crucial that we know about limitations also, and not to run into this situation we have had with registries where, it was even predefined, but potentially still not enough. So that when we look into registries, often the data quality is still not sufficient to take regulatory decisions. So but I think being optimistic again is to learn from this and to put it into this exercise now.
I just want to make one comment, Kanwaljit. The interesting part about neonatology is the need to link really the maternal records. So we see how that mother's complications in pregnancy are, the neonatal records, and then the longer term records. Mm-hmm. And I think, Ralph, you're correct. In Europe, we have a much better chance of being able to do that because of the way your healthcare systems are set up. In the United States, you may be delivering at one hospital, the baby may get transferred to another hospital for neonatal care, and then get follow-up for the next 10 years at another hospital, and then they switch insurance, and then they go to even a fourth place. So how do we somehow harmonize all those different data sets? It's going to be very complicated. So I actually think you have a better chance of doing that in some of your European communities, even though I imagine many of my European colleagues will say that would be a challenge as well.
Huge.
And I'll just add, in addition to kind of linkage, even within our systems, when you're talking about maybe another use of real world data to kind of expand and simplify our trials, a lot of that information that we collect on those CRFs can be extracted from the EHR, but then we have there's the data linkage between the trial data, EHR, if you're looking at claims data, those kinds of issues. And then there's also the use of unstructured data. So I think we found this in the BPD project as a challenge opportunity to realize that, where FiO2 is in the medical record is different depending on where you are. Sometimes it's documented in a respiratory therapist note. Sometimes it's documented as a, with the vital signs or the respiratory. So kind of being able to incorporate the unstructured data, if that's the piece of data that you need, is another area that I think really goes into being able to curate this and put it into an analyzable format.
Right. I think that definitely goes without saying that when you have opportunities, there are equal amount of challenges, especially when you're working with EHR data. But I personally have continued to believe that if there's a data type that has of most utility for neonatal drug development, it's probably EHR and in addition to others. Go ahead.
Yeah, when it comes to EHR, I mean, as I mentioned, we've been working on dealing with EHR data and trying to come up with a model based on EHR data. And the quality of the data really affects the quality of the model. So, John, to clinicians, anything you want to say to improve the record keeping, to improve the EHR data quality?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I mean, we've reached out to places like Epic, Cerner, who have the main electronic healthcare systems in the United States. And I don't know that they're all that motivated to want to work with us because this is just too important. And this is really necessary. And it's not, we're using neonatology to help drive the system, but this is really for all patients. Then think of I have 120 nurses in the NICU entering data. I have residents, physicians, assistants, other physicians, all putting data in. And have we ever trained anyone to do it in any kind of standardized format or way? Absolutely not. So, these are huge challenges that we have to work on, and yet I think we got a small glimpse as we put this data set together. And tomorrow we have a biostatistical large data group through the Tufts Clinical Translational Science Award Center that specializes in statistical analysis of large data sets. And they've been going through some of the EHR records and trying to map it to OMOP and other data standards. And it's been a challenge, but they're making progress. So you really need to have people who are sophisticated and understand these different data sources as they're putting these things together. I think Critical Path has some of that expertise. And I often say to Kanwaljit and Klaus, well, that's great. So just give us 5 times as many people to work on this data set. And if we had the resources, we could, because we have a variety of companies like Victoria coming to us and say, well, give us the rates of BPD. How about if we use these different definitions? What's the outcome? Tell us, as a kid with moderate BPD at birth, what happens to them when they're a year or 2 of life? Because that's really the critical thing. I mean, it's great that we can get rid of some of the respiratory support, and it really does make it easier for parents. But my whole career has been in trying to prevent the kinds of things that Deb has really talked about, to getting to the babies early on and improving their outcomes so they don't experience these kinds of complications throughout their entire life. Now, some of it may be that it's already the die is cast when they're born, because the process that causes that premature labor, which we don't really understand, but inflammation and other causes and stress. If you live in Japan, if you're a woman who lives in Japan, her rates of prematurity are about 4%. And I talk to Hide about that. When they move to the United States, within 4 years, their rates of prematurity are as bad as everybody else. So what is it about this environment? You watched the debates last night, maybe that's part of it. But what else is it about the environment within the United States? And for those of us that are in public health, we try to sort some of these things out, and it's complicated. But yet it's really critically important to do. And I agree with you. I think starting with the electronic health record in some way, shape, or form and trying to standardize data sets is going to be really important.
Thank you. I'm also looking at the clock here, and I wanted to allow some time to the audience to ask any questions if they have any. Yes, go ahead, Susie.
How could you do a panel without me getting up and
Oh,
saying how excited I am?
It wouldn't be the
to
same
have
without
this-
you.
To have this panel. So I'm Susie McCune. I'm at PPD. So thank you all for a wonderful discussion. First, I want to start by thanking Deb for such an eloquent discussion of Becky's journey and what it's been like both for Becky and for you. And I look forward to continuing to have you work with us and Becky to work with us on thinking about protocols for this, and especially thanking the FDA for the listening session last year. I think that was critically important. So I want, before I get to the question, and I just want to thank John for all your efforts. And I think that linking to the maternal records, I think is going to give us a lot more insight and potentially help us do a better job of that inclusion-exclusion criteria, because that's something that we struggle with when we don't see signals. And then I have a low-hanging fruit, since it was mentioned that we're all cowboys. Oh, I'm a neonatologist, by the way. And one of those cowboys, and that things may be different globally. Since this database is tremendously global, is it possible to think about where there are similarities and where there might be differences, and potentially how to be able to leverage that information. And now I'm going to take a step back and think about the last couple of days, and actually even the last few months, of a number of meetings where we've talked about rare disease. And thank you, Anne, for incorporating rare and neonatology. Thinking about the regulatory approaches that have been, I think, a lot more flexible, or at least thinking about how to utilize all the data in a way that facilitates being able to move forward with drugs. And listening to Peter this morning, and we're not in that gene therapy. Well, certainly we'll be in the gene therapy arena for certain, therapeutic indications. But for what we're talking about today with BPD, we're not in the gene therapy arena, so that those responses don't tend to be gangbusters. So how do we utilize that all the data that we have, that we've been talking about today, in a really unique way? So how do we use the database data? How do we use just in a rare disease kind of way to understand how many patients need to be enrolled in these trials, how many trials need to be done, and will we ever get to the point of where we're going to be able to do an accelerated approval in this kind of space? That was a very long-winded question. Sorry, guys.
You go ahead. I think, John, you have been involved with this data creation, and anybody else in the panel.
No, I'm going to let Anne
Yeah.
answer first.
Yeah, and I think, I think your comments mirrors, I think, what I was suggesting also earlier, is really thinking of, and will sound a little bit like a broken record from the regulatory side, but when we think about the real world data, it's it's relevance and reliability, right? So, I think we've mentioned the guidances that are out there, the suite of guidances around real world evidence, the real world evidence data standards that just was released in final form in December of last year, and then more recently the EHR and medical claims guidance to support regulatory decision making. I think those are really wonderful documents to dig into. But the concepts, again, of relevance, which is our context of use t-shirts that I think yesterday or the other day we were talking about, and reliability, is the data accurate, complete, and traceable. And that question of, how can we use these data and what do we have? And I think that some of those test cases, which is, I think, the approach that came in with this grant, to say, let's collect the data and then let's do a test case, because that helps us understand the relevance and reliability of the data, right? So if we frame the question and we see that we can answer a very discrete question, that helps us to QC and having the clinicians really involved in that step to QC the data and make sure we have some confidence in the data and that it's, to the question of, when we started looking at BPD and disease modeling and FI2 and realizing, you have to shift gears a little bit. And I think it's an iterative process. And I think that as you go through asking the question that you're asking, what can we answer and how can we leverage this? Where do we start? Helps us get to answer and understand, what's in this data set and how it can be used. So I think it's not a, roadmap. I think we start with, that small demonstration project, and then, I think that informs where we go next with it.
But I will, you brought up the genomics part, which I think is fascinating as we published last year 400 babies being admitted to NICUs with a variety of different medical and surgical problems and did whole genome sequencing and found a genetic diagnosis in over 50% of the babies. And that's been now confirmed with multiple studies from around the world. And so I think if we have the opportunity to look at some of this genomic data because, and we'll talk more about it in the next session with gene therapies, but if we can identify a lot of these different kids and treat them, we can make a difference. I think that some of the kids we're going to find, like Deb's daughter, may have certain genetic disorders or epigenetic or genetic changes that make them more susceptible to a variety of different conditions. If we can take some of the genomics and put that together with some of the clinical data, I think that's even going to be more powerful. And I suspect that Critical Path is one organization that really is, because you need a lot of data storage space to do this. And they're now talking about genetic sequencing as part of newborn screening to replace traditional newborn screening. So then you're going to have genomic data on millions and millions of children. And we have to be ready for that too, because then we're going to need to figure out exactly how to approach that.
Great. Thank you, John. And time for one last question. Go ahead, Hydran.
Yeah, maybe given the time that you already over time, more something so provoking than really wanting an answer. But I think when we look at your huge data set and we think on the challenges in neonatology, especially also for the companies, and I think and all the data you have, and we don't know how they really be usable. I think we touched on that briefly yesterday during the Darwin presentation, but I think Europe has a process to qualify data sets. So, and they do that. And I wonder how far a public-private partnership like Critical Path and using the 100,000 of data we now have in that data set, if that would be something where we could try to use maybe not the same, but a similar process which could be applied to maybe pre-qualify part of that data set for small companies who really want to come in and use that data, because not forgetting, doing this data qualification takes quite some time to my understanding, and also costs some money. So, and maybe supporting smaller companies and trying to get some of this data vetted, ensure the quality, know to understand the gaps and do some kind of a pre-qualification.
Great. Thank you.
I can answer that quickly. I think one comment from, I talked with our office medical policy colleagues before coming because they weren't able to join this panel. But I think the concept of regulatory grade data is an important concept to dispel a bit. It's not really a concept that we have set. So as we talked about, context of use. So whether the data set that you're using is fit for purpose for the particular question you're asking, unfortunately, is a bit of a case by case. Certainly you can leverage, if this data set has been used in another case or a similar case study or example, then obviously a lot of that work's been done and a lot of that justification and data standard evaluation has been done. But there's not really a path or a set for like a regulatory grade data set that's just kind of there for use because of that critical context of use piece. So.
And
No, I
last,
understand that
and-
you cannot completely qualify, but certainly in that range, you could do some of these steps which are independent or agnostic to an indication. You can look on the quality of the data. You can look if the data set is complete, if it is reliable, how many double things they have or things like that. So you maybe have a head start and it doesn't take 3 years, but maybe only 1.5.
And the important message, I think, is not to focus too much on the database being regulatory grade or the data being, but the process to get the data to a point where the solutions they support can be regulatory grade. And that process being fully documented and that's what can help everyone.
is very critically important. Last question for Judy. I know we're running over time, but go ahead, quick one.
So I'm Judy Ashner, yes, another neonatologist, but also the mother of a NICU baby who John took care of, who's almost 37 years old now. So I have two comments that are kind of questions, but the first one has to do with a word that did come up, but only briefly, and that is the role of the environment. And I believe that we are missing an important piece as we try to understand and untangle those children who are likely to be born preterm, those children who are likely to develop BPD, by not considering the totality of the environment. The NICU environment, don't forget, a lot of our preterm babies spend most of their third trimester developmental window in our NICU, a chemically intensive environment. The in utero environment and even the environment prenatally for the mom. And I think that's a missing piece of the puzzle and one that needs to get a little bit more attention. And so I'd like the panel's thoughts. My other comment is that I was really surprised that people didn't mention biomarkers more. Maybe it's all encompassed in data as we've been discussing it, but the tension of not treating infants with drugs who are not destined to develop BPD against the obvious advantages of early intervention to prevent rather than try to reverse a disease process is one that I think has stymied our field and really applies to many disease processes throughout the lifespan. And so those are my two comments. And I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts.
I think I can answer some of that, Judy. We do intend to solve that issue of the things that are not currently in the database, like biomarkers and like, prenatal factors. It's basically some of the things that we're considering will come in the next iteration of it. But go ahead, if anybody else Victoria.
Judy, thanks for the question. So environmental, absolutely. There are those unknowns that need to be known, and we need to pay certainly more attention to that. In terms of biomarkers, I mean, gestational age is one biomarker technically because it is a maturational assessment, provided that gestational age is appropriately assigned. And we're seeing the great majority of infants before they're born will have had an early fetal ultrasound that allows that. But the other is, what is the target of the therapeutic? So for example, deficiency states are really biomarkers. And so in our instance, it's IGF-1 deficiency. That is a biomarker of infants at greater risk, and that's been shown by real world data for the complications of prematurity. But you're absolutely right. It would be, if there were a universal biomarker that were a risk predictor, would certainly be lovely to have. One of the other confusing things in BPD is people often refer to BPD as a biomarker, which then really becomes a confusing mix of things. But your comments, I take those at heart, and they're, really relevant. And, we endeavor to do better, certainly in terms of the drugs that we're developing.
Awesome.
And I'll just say, Judy, I mean, obviously you're involved in the ECHO program. That's the environmental program that we're hoping will give us a lot more information on what's contributing to some of these causes of prematurity and poor outcomes.
So great. I would like to thank everybody in the panel and the audience. Had a really great engagement. for the session today. Thank you so much again. And